Hey everybody, it's Carolyn Bloom from Bloom Handmade Studio. I'm so glad to be back on the channel here today to tell you about my latest sweater project, which is a bottom-up hand knitted sweater that is filled with all sorts of customized details, including, which is why this video has been called the Provisional Cast On, including how I use that provisional cast on to allow me to modify the length, not just of the sleeves, but also the torso of the sweater. I'm really excited to get into the weeds of that topic with you, but I thought I would give you a little bit of a backstory on both the pattern itself and the yarn that I'm using and why it is that I'm doing some of the customization. If you're here just for the techniques, no worries at all. Please check out the show notes in the bottom of this video, and I will timestamp exactly when I get into the details of how to work the provisional cast on, how to unpick the provisional cast on, and resume knitting the opposite direction. So show notes are your friends here always on any of my videos. I'll give all the information of everything that I mention here in the podcast, as well as timestamp, as I said, when I get into the specific techniques. But before I show how I make that particular sausage, let me just give you a little bit of the backstory on that sweater that I'm making, as well as this particular sweater. Both of them came from this booklet by Norah Gaughn, which is volume number 8. And I went into my Ravelry profile to find out when it was that I finished this sweater, which was, believe it or not, almost 10 years ago. So I bought this booklet from Webb's when I went up to Amherst with a couple girlfriends back in 2011, and I fell in love with this particular booklet of Norah's. I'd like to make every single thing in this booklet, and so I bought it, and this particular yarn, which is Elsebeth Lavold Silky Wool, to make, I forget what this particular is called. Oh, the Nidden sweater. And I just love how this one turned out. It's a typical Norah Gaughn pattern, meaning that it's filled with all kinds of details and beautiful lace work to mimic cables. And the thing that really sold me on the sweater is that the detail goes all the way around the shoulder and then back down the other side on the front here. And I just loved that particular element to the design. So I bought the booklet, I got the yarn, and this was the first sweater that I cast on. I've worn this almost the entire winter. I like this cardigan and its fit so much. When it's hot in our apartment, off goes the cardigan easily. When I get cold, I just layer it on with a great shawl and I'm good to go. But I needed a new project, and so I went back to my favorite collection, number 8, and started thumbing through it to see if there was anything in here that would be perfect for a bottom-up sweater that I had in mind. And I did indeed find one here. This is called Nespelem, which is right here. I really love this particular cardigan and the look of it. Many features to it were exactly what I was looking for. I liked the collar. Once again, Norah brought the thunder here with a great collar detail. She did hers after the fact with a beautiful column of ribbing that she then sewed onto the sweater, or instructs the knitter to sew onto the sweater. And I thought, I can work with that. I have a specific embroidery idea that I want to explore, and some collar features were absolutely something that I could tweak in that sweater to make it exactly what I was looking for. But let me just go back to this and show you. As you can see here on the model, her sweater ends mid-forearm. And I don't know if you all know this about me, but I'm a tall gal. I'm about 6 feet tall, and I have the wingspan to match. Wings of an albatross, which are fantastic for giving hugs. Not so great when you're a knitter, and I have been burned more times than I care to recollect here today by starting a sweater bottom up only to discover it's not long enough and it's not where I want it to be. So I have started using the provisional cast on to work all of the beginnings of my sleeves and even my torsos, because I sit high in the saddle. Most of my height is sadly not in my legs, it's in my torso. And so I oftentimes will start a sweater with the provisional cast on, even for the front and the back pieces of a sweater. So I had thought, oh, I can't record this podcast until I have the sweater ready to go. But I'm going to push back against this concept and actually put the sweater on today so that you can get a sense of where it is that I am heading and why it was that I'm really glad that I used that provisional cast on method. So I'm going to do a little bit of a Mr. Rogers impersonation and pretend like I'm taking off my coat and go ahead and put on that other sweater so that you can see how using that provisional cast on this bottom-up sweater really worked for me. So bear with me here 1 second. I get this on. Fortunately, I have the part that I'm still knitting, the collar that I'm still knitting is on a really long needle, so I should be okay here as I try this sweater on. So here I am. I've got most of it knitted. I'm still working on the collar piece. What I opted to do instead of a beautiful ribbed column of stitching here along the collar, I finished all of the knitting and I'm now knitting inward. I picked up stitches along the front and the back neck of the piece, and I'm knitting inward. And I'll get a bit more into that here in a little while. But for now, let me just show you. Here's my sleeve, which this is even with about another 4 inches of length added to the sleeve beyond what the pattern calls for. So if I had stopped where the pattern had wanted me to stop, it would have been approximately mid-elbow, which nobody wants that. That's like a no man's land for a sleeve. It's neither short sleeve, it's not adorable 3/4 length, it's not wrist length. That's like just hard to wear and definitely unappealing length. So I had cast on right about the point where the pattern had told me to at that number of stitches. I worked my sleeve upward, and then once I finished it, I did all the blocking and all of those things. I unpicked that cast on and I'm now in the process of knitting my way back down. I have put the stitches for this particular sleeve on a holder so that I can revisit them if I need to, which I need to, after it had been blocked. So right now this is on a piece of waste yarn, all of those stitches, which will allow me to do a few more rows or inches of rows to make this sleeve exactly the way I want. The reason why I stopped there rather than just sorting it out at this point in time is that I want to have the entire sweater finished. I want to have this collar done. I want to have the embroidery added to it that I'm thinking about doing. I want to have everything finished. And then as a last step, I want to do those last few inches of knitting on my sleeves to make them exactly the way I want. I'm also contemplating doing a bit of embroidery on the sleeves, so I haven't decided yet whether or not I want to carry on in stockinette, i.e. just knits and purls all the way down to my wrist, or if at this point in time I want to go ahead and maybe put in some ribbing and just do some embroidery here on my forearm. I really won't be able to know what I want to do until the other parts of the sweater are finished, including this collar. And every last bit of those details have been sorted out, and I can put the sweater on and as a last step, do the details of those sleeves. So here is the sweater as it stands. As you can tell, it's a fantastic sweater. It has a little bit of detail in the back, as is Norah's wont. I'm hoping it's bright enough here today that you can see that there's ribbing up the spine of the sweater, which I love. It really is nice and flexible. And perhaps best of all, one of the things that I like about this sweater is it has a band of ribbing on the back where the waist should be. It's been a long year of a pandemic, and I need all the illusions of a waist that I can get from my knitting. So I was very happy to embrace that detail that Norah included in this pattern. And work that ribbing on the back section. So I think it'll have a beautiful silhouette. I really love how I'm working the collar. Let me scoot in here a little bit so you can see. You can see I just picked up the stitches here along the sides and I'm now working inward. I think that'll be a really lovely eye-catching feature to put some embroidery there. And I also think that the sleeves, once they're finished, will be another beautiful canvas. So again, if you're interested in this pattern and giving this a go, it's called Nespelem, Nespelem. It's from this beautiful collection of patterns from Norah Gaughn, but it's also available as an individual pattern on Ravelry if you prefer to go that way. For the yarn that I'm using for this sweater, this is Harrisville Nightshades in the colorway Dashboard. I purchased this at Rhinebeck in 2019. Gosh, it was a year and a half ago. So I'm really happy to finally have this in flight and working my way toward a beautiful sweater. All of the components seem to be coming in pretty well, and I'm really pleased to have used that provisional cast on to get started. So speaking of that, why don't we hop right into that technique? I'll show you how to do the provisional cast on. I'll show you how to get started knitting from that cast on. We'll knit a little bit and then we'll go back to the beginning, unzip the cast on and start knitting the other direction. So let's hop on over to that. To demonstrate the provisional cast on, these are the materials that I'll be using. I have DK weight yarn in 2 different colors, a set of knitting needles in a US 5, also known as 3.75 millimeter needles, and a crochet hook that happens to be the same size as the knitting needles, in other words 3.75 millimeters, or as we call it here in the US, an F hook. If you don't have a hook that's the exact same size as your needles, don't worry. Feel free to use any hook that's within, say, a 0.5 millimeter either direction of your needles. To get started, we're going to begin with a slip knot. To do that, simply take the tail of your yarn and place it underneath the body of your yarn, creating a loop. Pick that loop up, take the tail and place it through that loop, creating another loop. Looks like that. Through that second loop, insert your crochet hook, take your tail and the body of your yarn and pull them in opposite directions, making that loop nice and taut against your crochet hook. I like to anchor my yarn like this. I take the yarn coming from my crochet hook and place it between my middle finger and my ring finger. I then wave my hand like this and duck my middle finger and my pointer finger under that yarn. At this point, you can grab the tail of your yarn with your thumb and your middle finger and allow your pointer to become like a sewing machine needle. This can control the tension as you do this project. Now that our yarn is anchored, it's time to start adding loops to our knitting needle. Take your needle and place it parallel to your crochet hook. Reach over your crochet hook and grab the yarn and pull it over the knitting needle and through the loop that's on your hook. Go under your knitting needle with your yarn, reach over the top of your needle with your crochet hook, grab the yarn again, and pull it through the loop that was originally on your hook. Go behind the needle with the yarn, over the needle with the crochet hook, and pull the loop through. And this is a little dance that you'll do that'll start to feel like second nature as you add these loops onto your crochet or onto your knitting needle. So we have 5, let's do 5 more. So behind the needle with the yarn, over the needle with the hook, and so forth. I think we'll add a total of 10. That's a good amount. 2, 4, 6, 8. How about 2 more? There's 9, and here's 10. One of the things I like to do at this point is chain a few stitches, which acts like a placeholder for me so I know which end to undo when I'm ready to unpick the provisional cast on. So I just chained a couple of stitches, 3 or 4 stitches. Go ahead and pull that right through. And here you have a provisional cast on of 10 stitches, 3 chain stitches added on this end as a little indicator. This is what you're going to unpick when it comes time to start knitting the opposite direction. Now that your stitches have been casted on, it's time to start knitting. So I'm going to switch colors here and start using this wonderful hot pink. So I've stuck my knitting needle under the first stitch, and with a tail of about 4 to 6 inches long, I'm going to go between those 2 knitting needles and pull the first loop through. Drop my tail, pick up my body of my yarn, and begin knitting. You'll just knit like you would if you had cast it on any other way. So I'm going to go ahead and go across this row. And for this sample, I'm going to work a few rows of straight stockinette. So I'm going to drop right into time-lapse mode and pretend like I'm a really fast knitter. So bear with me here. I'll see once I've got a few rows completed. I finished a 6-row sample here, and I'm just completing the bind off of those rows so we can unpick that cast on and start knitting the other direction. So pretend this was your sleeve or the torso of a sweater. You've just celebrated working what you think might be the right length, or perhaps you know is the wrong length, and you're ready to start doing some customization. It's time to unpick this cast on and start working this way. So here's our bound off edge when we are working this way from our cast on. We're now going to turn our swatch around, unpick all of these stitches, and put those live stitches that are remaining in the pink on our knitting needle. So let's come back to the side that has those chained stitches. You can use the tip of your knitting needle to undo that chain, loosening up that edge, getting a hold of your yarn and pulling it through that last loop so that you can then easily, hopefully easily, undo these stitches. Okay, so here I have it now back to the point where it's ready to be undone. So grab that end of your yarn, give it a tug, setting free now our pink stitching. You might need to move your tail out of the way to do so. So here's the last chain stitch, or the first chain stitch we created after having added the stitches to our knitting needle. I like to anchor those knitting stitches first before I undo that last loop. So I've slid my needle in from front to the back. Now I'm going to grab that contrast yarn, that waste yarn, give a little tug, revealing 1 knitted stitch on my knitting needle. Let me show you that again. From front to the back, put that pink yarn, that contrast yarn, onto your needle, give a little tug. And you'll repeat this all the way across, setting free those stitches. And sometimes I find it helpful if you want to just pull that waste yarn back, it'll reveal the pink stitch, making it even easier to identify where to put that knitting needle so that those stitches are abundantly clear which ones go on to the needle. Okay, now here we are. This is the first stitch that we worked. I'm going to place my needle, as I did before, into that stitch. Go ahead and pull out your yarn. And it may look like that stitch is twisted depending on how you extricate it. I always like to have the right leg of my knitting stitches facing forward, so I just flip that around and have it looking like all of the other stitches. If you are going to do this before you do any ribbing, you'll note that you are half of a stitch off. And if you aren't careful with that last stitch that you revealed, having undone your slip knot, you may need to increase by 1 stitch in order to keep with 10 stitches live on your needle. We are now ready to start knitting the opposite direction. Starting with a fresh strand of hot pink yarn, I'm going to just begin knitting like I would any other piece. My knit side is facing, so that's what I'm doing. That's the stitch I'm using right now. And you can see how wonderful this is as a technique to add extra length should you need it for sleeves or your torso, or even if you wanted to just make a shawl a little longer. This can be so handy. So there's one row of knitting being added the opposite direction from how we began. I'll also mention that this is a wonderful time too if you are more petite, say, than I am, and you wanted to remove rows of knitting. Once you've unpicked that cast on, you can then just start pulling out the rows of knitting, thereby taking away the length that you need. I hope this helps. All right, I hope that proved useful to you and that the technique is now a bit clearer, as well as how to apply the technique to your projects. If you'd like to see how this sweater evolves as we go through the final lap and get those devilish last details tended to, and I apply the embroidery, please follow me over on Instagram. My name over there is Bloom Handmade Studio. You can also find out more by subscribing to my newsletter, which you can do on my website, which is bloomhandmadestudio.com. I believe to sign up for the newsletter, you just find the little box on the lower left corner on the main page. If you're interested in taking classes with me to learn how to embroider your knitting, you can find my class schedule on my website on the main menu, where to find me. And of course, I'll also include information about the classes in my newsletter and on Instagram. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you enjoyed today's video, please give a little thumbs up or leave a comment. It really helps encourage me to make another one. And if you really enjoyed it, don't hesitate to subscribe to future videos. I will probably do another one to show the finished version of this sweater, including all the embroidery that I'm going to do on the collar as well as on the sleeves. So if you're following along, you'll know immediately when that next video is up and ready to view. Until then, thank you so much for tuning in today, and I will hope to see you again soon at Bloom Handmade Studio. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.